Hi everyone, welcome to WeWork. My name's Michael and I run all of our member experience and events here at WeWork White House. By quick show of hands, how many people have been in a WeWork before? Cool, it's like less than half of you, so that's awesome. So the reason why we do and host events like this is because, one, the topic is very interesting, and two, we here at WeWork are more than just, a co-working space. We really pride ourselves on our community here and our ability to convene in our spaces and for our members to help create that experience with us. So we're very excited to host this event tonight. WeWork White House has kind of become a hub of blockchain here in DC. So we have a lot of members who work on blockchain. So it's really exciting to welcome you all here. So if you have any questions about WeWork, feel free to come chat with me afterwards. And I won't take up too much of your time because I can't talk about blockchain. So I will pass over to Ala, who can.
Thank you. Disclaimer, I also cannot talk about blockchain, but I wanted to welcome all of you here tonight as well. Thank you guys for coming, and a very special thank you to WeWork and also to the Global Blockchain Business Council for co-hosting and sponsoring this event. So raise your hand if this is your first YPE event. Okay, lots of new faces, lots of familiar faces as well. So my name is Ala Lipsky, and I'm the director of the DC chapter of Young Professionals in Energy. We are a global nonprofit organization. We have 2,500 members here in Washington, and our mission is to support the advancement of young professionals in the energy industry. So we do that by providing opportunities for networking, for career development, and for knowledge acquisition, which we're certainly going to be doing today. Since last year, I've been fascinated by blockchain. It's certainly built quite a buzz, so much so my mom actually called me last week and was asking me if I knew anything about it. At first, I was thinking more along the lines of Bitcoin. I think some of you have probably heard that there's all these articles out there saying how energy intensive it is mining for Bitcoin, but that's definitely not the main use or the only use for blockchain. And then I started thinking about the different ways that the blockchain technology could be used in the energy sector. So I did a little bit of research. According to Green Tech Media, as of March 2018, there were 122 blockchain companies operating in the energy space. So we're really lucky that we have a couple of them here today. We've got a stellar program. I'm really excited. I hope you guys are excited as well. And with that, I'm going to turn it over to Lee Brenner. Lee is the Chief Strategy Officer at GBBC, and he's going to introduce our panelists. After the panel, we're going to have a quick walkthrough of the Origin app. So spoiler alert, it runs on blockchain. And then we'll have plenty of time for some more networking and obviously for Q&A. So thank you guys for coming tonight.
Thank you. All right, thank you. Come on out. Well, we're not going to, this is like, there's no music or anything, so come on out. There, that works. Thank you, Ala, for the intro. And my name is Lee Brenner. As Ala mentioned, I'm the Chief Strategy Officer of the Global Blockchain Business Council. I'll tell you a little bit more about that in a second, but we have a great group of people here for you to really learn about what we're going to make this as much as possible a 101, not necessarily the technology, and we're not going to get into a very technical standards or anything, but making sure that there's at least a basic understanding, because I think very quickly in these conversations, this technology and this industry is moving so quickly that you'll go to an event and someone will ask a question or someone will say something and they're off on a tangent, and 98% of the people in the audience have no clue what the first thing that was said was, and they're still trying to catch up. Half the panelists may not understand what's happening. So we want to try and do that, and also kind of rule setting. Feel free to jump in. If you guys have questions, if something isn't making sense, if you don't understand a term, don't be embarrassed, and just jump in, raise your hand, and we'll try to answer it. So with that, I'll introduce my panel here and let them give a few minutes on what they're doing now, what their backgrounds are, and what led them to being here. So first and foremost, to my right, not necessarily foremost, I shouldn't have said that, I suppose, but first, To my right, Dante Disparte, who his hat here, he's the CEO of Risk Cooperative, which he'll tell you about, but his hat here is a strategic advisor for a company called Power Ledger. Doug Miller, to Dante's right, is with the Energy Web Foundation. He's the one who's going to be telling you about the Origin app later, but he's the Origin Market Development and Regulatory Affairs Manager with the Energy Web Foundation. And Kristin Smith at the end of the aisle, who's advisor with Thompson Coburn, a major law firm. So first, let's actually start with Kristin. Tell us, just give us a sense of what brought you here. How'd you get into this world?
I got into this world by accident. I'm a lobbyist at a law firm, so I'm not a lawyer, but know a lot about policy. And when I switched jobs, one of the clients that I was assigned was getting a lot of, doing a lot of things that in the blockchain space. And I had zero idea what that even was when I signed up for the job about a year ago. But as you'll kind of find when you talk to people in this space, nobody has been doing this for very long, and a little bit of knowledge apparently goes a long way. So, but it's quickly grown, and I now spend probably at least 50% of my time in growing on blockchain, and been working with clients at our firm in California and even internationally. So it's definitely a hot and growing space.
Yeah, same question.
Hey everybody, Doug Miller from the Energy Web Foundation. My background is in clean energy and behavioral science, and so for me, from the very get-go, getting started with my career, the key question that's driven my work is how can we make the transition to clean energy as easy as possible? And for me, that's what drew me to blockchain technology. It seems like this is a potential technology to make certain things that we don't want to have to deal with easier, whether it's paperwork, whether it's automating certain transactions or behavioral changes. And so that's what drew me into this world. I am not a programmer. And my role at Energy Web Foundation is to translate the needs of what we hear from electric utilities, energy companies, other participants, as well as regulators, into then the right boxes for our programmers on our development team to then turn into the Origin application or other parts of the Energy Web.
Cool. Yeah, 2 mics. Hi everyone, I'm Dante Disparte. So as Lee said, I'm the founder and CEO of a company called Risk Cooperative, which is very active in the finance and resilience domain. And then I'm also a strategic advisor with an Australian firm called Power Ledger. Power Ledger is a company based in Australia that has leveraged blockchain to create sort of an energy metering platform, and using blockchain to just create much more efficiency and transparency in the energy marketplace. And so, yeah, happy to be here and eager for a good panel. Thanks.
Great, and kind of to illustrate Kristin's point about little knowledge going a long way, I'll tell you quickly my background. As Ala mentioned before, I'm Chief Strategy Officer of the Global Blockchain Business Council. This organization launched just a year and a half ago at the World Economic Forum, but before then, so the whole industry and our organization is all new and burgeoning and quickly developing. My background is I started in the news world, worked at CNN for a long time as a producer and a journalist, and then moved into technology and worked at MySpace. How many people had a MySpace page? How many people have a MySpace page? Yes. Oh, okay. So did that for a bit, and then kind of worked in the mix between social media and politics and public affairs, and really kind of the early days of civic technology, and then moved into the startup world and did that for a bit, and then worked in the civic technology space at Microsoft, and that then did that for a few years, and then really started to recognize that this blockchain was one of those main technologies that was going to be an underpinning of so many different industries, and recognize that as both businesses that are doing it from an industry side, civic organizations are using it, governments are starting to figure out both how they need to both regulate it and potentially use it for their own uses. So really something that is potentially has a huge impact across so many different sectors. So all that said, let's take it back, and we'll go back to where the 101 part, right? So let's start from the beginning. And I'll throw it to Dante to do this. first and foremost, well, actually, let's ask this first. Who's heard of blockchain besides this event and the slide up there? All right, so of the people who raised their hands, who could explain it to their parents? Okay. And I'm going to ask the people who just raised their hands to stand up and explain it to us. Who could do that? All right, so with that, Dante, give us the very basic 101. What is blockchain? What does it mean when people are talking about either putting people on, and I'll specify the blockchain or a blockchain?
Ironically, because it says 101, this is actually hard. I'll paraphrase. Albert Einstein said, "You don't know a subject well enough unless you could describe it briefly." So I'm going to give this a shot. You know what an Excel spreadsheet is, right? I don't even need a show of hands. I presume that's a universal truth. And you know what a connected device is or a database is. And you know that one of the big flaws we have in how we design and organize that data is the fact that it's centralized, that only one party has access to that database, right? So in an Excel spreadsheet on one computer, one database, raises the probability that if something happens to that database, that data is lost forever. We stop right there. What blockchain then is that same set of materials for organizing data, the same concept of a database, except the fact that the data is now stored in a decentralized manner and a physically dispersed manner. So when you add those two properties, all of a sudden how that information is recorded becomes very, very hard to erase, if not by current standards impossible, and very hard to modify in any form unless it happens simultaneously across each and every one of these nodes. So I'll stop there. So a database or a spreadsheet or a way of recording information that is completely decentralized, and the result being a higher level of security than you would have otherwise, and a higher level of edit proofing, if you will, than you would have otherwise.
Doug, let me ask you, sort of add on to that, the key words that are often used with a blockchain are, immutability. Once it's there, it can't be changed. The data that is up there can't be changed. It can be, later in the sync, you could say, oh, we made a mistake back there, but it's available for everyone to see that you made a mistake, right? Or that a mistake was made. So one, see if you can explain how that works in an easy way. And then there's the trust factor, the idea that all the parties using this type of platform trust the system because of the algorithms involved and the way that well, you heard the term nodes, the different computers that are connected to each other work. How does that make things better than what is already existing?
Sure. Well, first I'll get started by saying that everybody should be patient with yourselves when you're trying to understand this technology. How many people in the room also maybe understand how Wi-Fi networks work, how the internet works? Just one thing that's interesting to see over the past year is how interested people are in learning how the technology itself operates, which is, I think, something that hasn't happened with other technologies. The best way for me to think about what a blockchain is that it's a decentralized computer. So even though any articles you might read about blockchain it's sort of this thing that everybody can see. It creates this shared truth. If you think about it as a computer that everybody can access, then that's sort of, I think, a way to conceptualize what is going on in a blockchain. And when you think about why this notion of why something that creates greater security and this notion of a shared truth is, if you think about essentially, depending on the blockchain, on a specific amount of time, let's say it's 10 minutes for Bitcoin or some other cadence depending on the blockchain at hand, all the information that goes into the block forms a fingerprint essentially. And if any information in that block changes, it changes what the fingerprint looks like, and everybody who's looking at the shared computer can see that it's changed. And the next, say it's Bitcoin again, the next 10 minutes down the road, when the next block is being formed, if something happens to a prior block, it then changes the fingerprint from before, changes the next fingerprint moving forward, and then everybody again can see that somebody's manipulating something, and people will reject that action. And so that's a way to see, where the shared truth is coming from. And I think in terms of its application in the business world, there are certain opportunities where people want to see this shared story about what's happening. So specific, and we'll talk more about this later, specific to, say, renewable energy certificates in the energy sector. This is something where multiple parties want to see who owns a particular thing and want to make sure that no two people own the same thing, because it is this digital product. And this is a way to structure the way that these business relations happen.
So, Kristin, I want to ask you, in terms of what Doug said, the business applications of it. People are paying attention to how it's going to be used, and I think we'll get into some of the specific use cases. But Doug mentioned Bitcoin in terms of and we're going to describe this too, the Bitcoin blockchain, because there are different types of blockchain. But as you're seeing from the perspective of law firms or people that are coming to you for advice, what are the applications that you are seeing in sort of the basic terms that are needing regulation, needing advice? What are people looking at, not from a technical perspective, but from the real world perspective?
Well, I'll get to that in a second, but before I'll add to what Dante and Doug said. I think what they describe, this system of really what is a distributed spreadsheet or database or just a ledger. That's the word I would use with my parents, because they might not know what an Excel spreadsheet is. It's a ledger. It's nothing glamorous. It's just a list of a record of transactions. But the way that it's described, being decentralized, and also the security application, those security features that are built into it, mean that you can conduct transactions on a peer-to-peer basis without having a central organization in the middle keep track of the transaction or the ledger or whatever asset is moving back and forth. And so that's kind of important to think about, is it really takes the middleman out of things, at least in theory. And then the other aspect, which we'll kind of get into the regulatory question, is the way the system is set up means that for the first time, unlike all the internet we all grew up with, you can actually have a digital asset. And what I mean by that is, if you think of, if you want to take a photo of us here and put it on social media and tweet it, and all of a sudden this one photo of us could be shared around the world instantaneously with perfect copies. That's great if you're sharing photos, but it's not great if you have something valuable, because that undermines the entire system. So we have these digital assets, and they can represent something like Bitcoin that we are probably all most familiar with, which is almost a replacement for currency in some contexts, or a store of value in other contexts. It can be used as a token can be created that can be a store of a mechanism for companies to raise money. This is what we hear when we hear initial coin offerings and ICOs, which I think we can get more into. It could also be used to represent a traditional security, whether it be a publicly traded security or a privately traded security. We don't see much of that today, but that's something that's out there. So the system allows us to have these digital assets, and when we're moving digital assets around on a blockchain, there's a whole host of regulatory issues that come to play, especially when you're dealing with capital raising and securities, and trying to figure out what is a security and what is not a security. And there are issues with the Department of Treasury that deal with anti-money laundering or tax policy. So there are a whole host of regulatory issues, and these are the types of things that we're working with our clients to figure out, A, interpret what is happening today, but B, see if there needs to be any changes to our existing structures that we work within. So
two more questions on the 101 part. Give us, and anybody can jump in, blockchain versus, and Kristin, you sort of talked about this, blockchain versus cryptocurrencies. And then the second question is kind of the difference between a public blockchain and a private or permissioned blockchain. Anybody? Yeah.
Go ahead, Dante.
All right. So well, the cryptocurrency, I'll take the easy one. Yeah. So a cryptocurrency, there's more than 1,600 of them on the planet today. The vast majority are really experimental, if you will. Of them, Bitcoin and Ethereum or Ether are the two that are probably the most widely known and the most widely invested in, and that are truly decentralized, meaning there is no single firm or entity that owns them. They were put out there in a sort of a designated quantity, so there's only supposedly 21 million Bitcoin in total. So a cryptocurrency is a digital asset that can be used for a whole host of functions, but the primary one today being a store of value. People are not necessarily using cryptocurrencies as a means of exchange the way the greenback or the US dollar is being used, but they're generally being kept as a store of value by investors. How this is different from a blockchain and what blockchain is ultimately is blockchain is, as I think Kristin rightly pointed out, is the ledger, so the general ledger on which these transactions are being recorded. Blockchain is the underlying technology that registers each and every one of these transactions. And this is critical. The only reason a digital asset can exist in this manner is because with blockchain behind it, there is no such issue as double counting, right? Today, in the analog economy, so the traditional economy where all of our dollars are being stored, we need a massive overhead structure of banks and regulators and treasury departments to ensure that the $100,000 you might have in your bank account actually exist, lest we have that double counting issue show up. All of this is now being done without any intermediaries, without any human beings effectively managing this entire system. And blockchain is the underlying layer that is solving for that problem. Scalable, no double counting, high levels of trust. Clearly some negative externalities in terms of energy consumption on Bitcoin mining and things like that, but that's the distinction between the two. And a cryptocurrency, as Kristin alluded to a moment ago, can also be a representation of someone's ownership in an underlying asset. So a utility token, or sort of a cryptocurrency that is associated with a project or a particular function can also effectively take that form. And one key distinction between a cryptocurrency and an analog currency, a dollar, is that a cryptocurrency is technically code. A dollar cannot be coded to do anything, whereas a cryptocurrency can. And so that's an important thing, because obviously a lot of that is what allows for functions to be carried out in these types of projects and in the digital economy.
And adding to that, I think, you know, if you think of a cryptocurrency as a digital asset, the difference to then other applications that are emerging in blockchain, and I think, you know, following the hype cycle, there's been less news coverage of blockchain over the past few weeks as the ICOs have maybe been less successful of late. The real thing that people are getting excited about in the business world are smart contracts. And so these are essentially, it's programming language that says if X happens, then execute Y. So imagine you are a multinational corporate here in the US. For those who are energy sector people in the room, you're putting together a power purchase agreement. So a 20-year agreement over a fixed price where essentially a company wants proof on, you know, right now it's on a yearly basis, maybe they want a daily or monthly basis saying, I'm buying renewable energy from this power plant every week for the next 20 years, and I want that proof. They want the receipt showing this. This is a way to start automating those transfers and have the paperwork streamlined where it then doesn't have to go through a third-party broker. And that's an example of the types of applications that blockchain enables. Then in terms of the question about
public versus permissioned.
Public versus permissioned blockchains. So Bitcoin is a public blockchain. It's something where anybody can serve as a miner. What that means is essentially that it's a free-for-all where miners will work to solve a complex code as fast as possible, meaning that there's then a race to increasing computational power to solve that code first. And that's why you might be seeing stories about the energy consumption associated with Bitcoin. And also with those, it means anybody can access it, not even as a miner, but to initiate transactions. There are then on the other side of the spectrum, private blockchains, which require what's called permissioning, where you have to be accepted to participate in the blockchain, whether that's as a miner or even as a participant. And this is, you know, something that companies like IBM are putting together for internal company operations, for example. There's then sort of a hybrid, which is actually where the Energy Web Foundation fits, where we're using what's called a proof of authority consensus mechanism. And what that means is that while we're developing a public blockchain that anybody in this room can essentially participate in, at the same time, it's not a free-for-all for the miners. They're not technically called miners in our system, they're called authorities, but they operate more or less as a miner, where a permission set of roughly 50 to 100 validators are whitelisted, and meaning they're given approval to join, and then they are randomly selected to solve less complicated code that remains stable throughout. So we actually did an experiment with the beta version of what we have, and the comparison is the estimates around Bitcoin have been that energy consumption is around 2 or 3 countries worth, say something like Iceland and Ireland. When you look at the energy consumption of our system, we're looking at 2 or 3 houses. So it's a huge magnitude of difference depending on what type of consensus mechanism you're using.
And just to add to the confusion, especially when talking to an energy group, the people who started this and created it decided to name solving the algorithm mining. And so when we're talking, the GBBC, we talk to business leaders all over, and we say, well, mining. And they're like, well, wait, what are we doing? Or you said miner, and people are like, wait, kids are doing this? What's happening? So when you say it, they're not actually digging for anything, per se. They are literally solving a computer is solving an algorithm, and that creates what they're calling mining, or the miners are the hashes, right? Or the people that are the computers that are doing that. So again, it's just we talk to people all the time, but very quickly we forget that some of the terms, we talk about them all the time, but it's confusing to folks. And I went to, the GBBC went to Zero Week, which in Houston is a major energy conference, to do a lot of blockchain discussions and talk to major companies. And when you say to a company that is actually doing mining, that no, we're doing mining, they're like, no, let me tell you about mining, right? But with that, I think it's important. Let's transition now to talk about how it can actually be used. I mean, that's one of the things that we do when we're talking. I think all of us, when we're talking to people who are trying to learn about it, or business executives, or regulators, or government leaders, it's always helpful to talk about real-world examples before you even get back to how it's going to apply in their company. Thinking about how other people are doing it, what's actually being used. So. First question is how can the technology, blockchain technology, in a few examples, be used in the energy sector?
I'll take the softball pitch. So many of you in the room, young energy professionals, I would pay close attention to what the technology can do versus what the technology is. Like the internet before it, there's articles in Harvard Business Review that liken blockchain to a foundational technology like the internet. But the internet only began to change the world when we stopped talking about it and we started seeing outcomes. So one thing I'm willing to predict as a sort of use case for blockchain. So in the state of California, the building code in the state of California, starting in 2020, mandates that new houses have to be solar ready effectively. So starting in 2020, that's 80,000 new houses every year thereafter are now solar enabled. So if you stop there and you say, as part of California's strategy to wean itself off of carbon and the traditional sort of energy economy, bravo, California. Except one of the challenges this creates is it's adding $12,000 to $15,000 to housing prices in a state that already has an affordable housing issue. So without blockchain and without a company like Power Ledger as an example, each house in California might be generating solar energy. They're doing this in a renewable manner. It's strategic. It's part of the sort of state strategy on decarbonizing its economy. But without blockchain, the concept of then being able to resell energy to the neighbor's house that might be an old housing stock, right, that doesn't have solar panels on the roof, that concept of creating a microgrid and being able to sort of reach that last mile, very, very hard to conceive of, scaling that up. And so blockchain being a technology that underpins the advent of cryptocurrencies and digital currencies that have become $1 trillion asset class with no centralized authority, without any bank behind it. Without blockchain applied to that use case, it's very hard to see the Californian example going its full potential, which would be to equip each household into California's economy as an extension of a hub and spoke sort of strategy for its energy security. That's just one sort of simple example. The other one is in Puerto Rico, where I'm from, which if you think about what is the centralized energy matrix of an island economy, it's a single point of failure, right? So when hurricanes Irma and Maria came through the Caribbean, any island, in which in this case every island that had the traditional energy matrix was a target for climate risk and climate change, and repairing a centralized structure takes what it's taken in Puerto Rico. More than 6 months, lots of failures, and you're just basically setting up, instead of a build back better strategy, you're setting up exactly the same thing that you lost. And so in these types of cases, blockchain can enable microgrids, can enable last mile sort of rural electrification, and more importantly, can enable folks that put up single generation capabilities, for example, for their company and cogeneration projects, can now conceive of how to extend that energy into their communities and to their immediate environment. So that when the lights do go out in the centralized grid, you have a fail-safe that can also help put communities back online effectively. So I think in those two areas, and then the last area would be cybersecurity. That because of the way the data is now being organized and the implied security of this distributed model, we don't have, from a data vantage point, the single point of failure that you now have in the traditional grid. So in the Ukraine, Russian forces effectively were able to strike the Ukrainian power grid because of that single point of failure nature that we have and how data is being organized. So here too, you could see some really interesting implications for using blockchain to create a more, to create an air gap, if you will, between the data that is critical to infrastructure and energy and how it's being accessed by other parties.
Just to add to that, so at EWF, we've worked with energy companies and utilities from around the globe to identify what we think are the top 5 most valuable applications in the energy sector using blockchain. In addition to some others, but the ones that these companies are most excited about include, and I'll provide a brief example about each to explain how they work, include utility billing systems, demand response programs, electric vehicle charging networks, renewable energy certificate or equivalent markets around the world. And then lastly, the one that we're most excited about is transactive energy systems, where we completely changed the scenario of what's happened in Puerto Rico, for example, but also across really any energy market. So if you think about a billing system, in competitive markets like what you have in Europe, where we don't have this as much in the US, unfortunately, you're able to easily switch from your current utility to a new utility if you, say, prioritize clean energy and you want to go to the clean energy provider. Right now, it's difficult to make that switch happen. You go through different processes, essentially a whole bunch of bureaucracy. How can we create essentially a cryptographic ID where anybody, no matter which provider they are currently with, they can easily switch and they take their ID with them, and then their home and all the devices that fall under their ID transfer with them in a few clicks of a button. And this can make it, reduce a behavioral barrier to switching to a clean energy provider. When you think about electric vehicles right now, if you go from one city to the next, or one state to the next, or one country to the next, depending on where you are, the charging network might have an entirely different billing system associated with paying for the charging. We're working to build a similar arrangement with cryptographic IDs, where if a vehicle and an owner are identified together, have the payments already uploaded with wallets, so that it doesn't matter where you're connecting your car, you can pay. And then even better, if it happens to be a windy night and you're charged overnight and there's extra energy on the grid, your electric vehicle can serve as a battery and you get paid for that service, no matter where you're plugged in. And then in terms of demand response programs, for those who aren't familiar, that's a situation like today, probably right now, where PEPCO here in DC is saying, please power down your systems. It's really hot. As everybody gets home and turns on the air conditioners, we don't want to open up the extra polluting power plant right now. And to encourage people to do that, they tell people to turn down their thermostats a few degrees. Right now then, it takes months to determine who participated, by how much do we pay them. How do we actually make that happen automatically, because all the devices roll up to the customer ID, where then not only the payments can start happening instantaneously, all of the smart thermostats, smart appliances are actually pre-programmed so they know what to do when certain situations like this happen. And there's no need for anybody to do anything in their house, it just happens automatically. The last one then, if you have anything to add on, With renewable energy certificates, this is a situation where people want to buy renewable energy and know they're getting the proof of renewable energy. How do we create a tool where no matter whether you're a large company, a medium-sized company, or a household, if you want to buy renewable energy today, it's a lot like the way travel used to work, where you had to work through a travel agent and you get documentation slowly in snail mail. We're working to create a situation where you can get the information directly from the assets, the data is pushed directly from renewable assets, and then even on the flip side, you can connect your home so that based on your actual consumption in your house, let's say you consumed X amount of energy today, Y tomorrow, Z the next day, that would actually specify in what we talked about earlier, a smart contract, buy X amount of renewable energy today, Y tomorrow, and Z the following day.
Kristin, go for it.
The only thing I can maybe think to add is energy trading. That's another application, because anytime you're moving an asset back and forth, blockchain has the potential to be value added, but you got most of them.
Yeah. So one of the things that when we were meeting with, whether it's business leaders or regulators, they always, especially in a business situation, they'll ask, we ask them, what are their friction points? Because blockchain is not a solution, even if it is everywhere in every newspaper and you're reading about it everywhere. It's not necessarily a solution for everything. And even when it might be a solution, it may not be a solution in and of itself, right? It might need to be paired with another technology. When we're talking about smart grids, it might be AI or some other technology that may already be out there or something that's being developed. But it is an underlying technology that might be a major component of that. So we ask companies, what are those friction points? And then, and where potentially can blockchain be utilized, whether it's in their supply chain? Can it save, if you're talking about a company like Exxon or someone who has billions of dollars going through their supply chain constantly, and if they can save 1%, that's a huge difference, right? Or if they're talking about transaction costs or in the trading space. So that's one from the industry perspective. And then we look at regulators and sort of the policy aspects of this. You hear about, and let's talk about this a little bit now from the trading perspective, you hear about the securities angle of Bitcoin and the cryptocurrencies, but then thinking about how the technology, the underlying technology, either the difficulty of having companies here who are either building a currency and because of the regulations, it makes it more difficult to have the company building their technology, whether it's here in the United States or somewhere else. But regulators are starting to have to start thinking through, one, how does it affect the existing industries? But then potentially, if this is going to become a major industry of the future, do they want to be pushing all of these companies or attracting them to them? So I'll ask Kristin first to start on that end. How do you see some of the policies or policymakers? You worked on Capitol Hill for a long time. How do you see them thinking about this new technology? I mean, as someone who helped try to explain social media to them years ago, clearly they're either just starting to get it or they completely jumped the shark, right? How are they thinking about it?
Yeah, we sort of have two different categories out there. We have regulators that need to understand because this is new and it's coming along and it has to fit within whatever regulatory framework they have. They tend to be a little bit more sophisticated, whether it be the CFTC or FTC or SEC. They have experts that follow this space regularly. Congress is a different animal. Congress is busy. Congressmen and senators have to know everything about every issue, and they tend to employ people much younger than I am who are smart and ambitious, but they've got a lot on their plate to answer. And so the couple things have happened with I think because of the skyrocketing of Bitcoin this past year, there's been a lot of interest in this space, and we've seen committees in both the House and Senate that are holding hearings and are trying to understand, what needs to be done. We've also seen the formation of the Congressional Blockchain Caucus, which is working to host events similar to this and educate members and their staffs. But I think that the key thing they're going to have to look at is technology can kind of do two things. It can improve existing processes, or it could actually do something entirely new. A lot of, I think, what we've seen so far, at least on the financial services side, is probably just an improvement of how we do capital raising, right? With all of these ICOs, it's just a quicker way to do crowdfunding. That's regulated. That's that's called a security. There's plenty of laws on the books. I think the question is there some advantage to the way we do it, where we can maybe relax some of the regulations because there's more transparency there? Or do we have something entirely new that really needs kind of a new regime? And I'm not sure we are there yet, at least on sort of the capital markets and money and banking side. I definitely don't think we're there yet with energy. But there are going to be rules that need to comply. I know some of the microgrids, I know there are rules in some jurisdictions that prevent that sort of thing from happening. There's a good example, there was a trial of a microgrid up in Brooklyn where some neighbors kind of rigged together their, with help, professional help, rigged together their solar panels and are buying and selling energy from each other. I don't consider myself the greenest person. This is probably on video. But I think that's cool. I would do that in my neighborhood because I would know exactly where I'm getting my energy from. And so there's going to have to be rule changes in some places to do things like that. And so it's really going to be a case-by-case basis.
Following on that, Dante, what are some of the obstacles or roadblocks that a company that is either looking to implement blockchain or companies that are implementing or developing blockchain are thinking about, but either from a regulatory perspective or logistics perspective, how they can do their business in, whether it's here in the United States or anywhere else?
Yeah, so I recently was able to actually address the Congressional Blockchain Caucus not long ago, and I come at the blockchain conversation from the vantage point of what is not working in the current economy as it's structured today. And when you look at it from that lens and you see what has transpired in Puerto Rico, for example, again, $94 billion repair, and that the current model with one central authority, the public utility PREPA, which represents 20% of the municipal debt on the island, when you look at it from that model, and you say to yourself, from a regulatory point of view or from just maintaining corporate status quo point of view, the current model doesn't really work. The same would hold true of banking, the same would hold true of finance, the way we think of the capital markets and capital access. And so when technologies like this one, and again, I think you brought up the right point, Lee, which is that it doesn't exist in a vacuum. Blockchain is part of a broader journey and storyboard of digital transformation. A whole generation of humanity was born with a smartphone in their hands, and you want instant gratification. You have turned Facebook into a public census or a utility, and you get your information in 280 characters. So that consumer has a different set of expectations and a different set of priorities around instantaneity in terms of their life and what you're willing to trade off for that. You're also blindingly trusting of technology. And so here we have in blockchain a technology that has proven that humans who do not know each other can trust each other and part ways with billions of dollars of hard-earned analog digital fiat currency, real fiat currency, in exchange for something that they cannot hold, touch, and has no functional utility today in the economy as we know it. And so in that world, anybody clinging on to status quo, which sadly is many of the current entrenched companies, I think has a lot to adjust to. It's kind of a good example would be JCPenney and Sears dismissing the advent of Amazon once upon a time. This technology and the age that it is heralding isn't necessarily going to go away, and that what a lot of us are demanding, a lot of the frustrations we have in terms of institutional trust. Equifax breach exposes 150 million people's personal data for the rest of their lifetimes. A lot of that stuff is born out of a world where data and information is being organized in a centralized manner with only one party benefiting and another party paying for the cost. People want that to be calibrated. And frankly, I mean, the conversation with the Congressional Blockchain Caucus suggested that at least some of our lawmakers are starting to take that conversation very seriously and think about the public policy and national security implications of just recalibrating what it means to have trust in an institution.
Okay, with that, we're actually going to, Doug, why don't you give kind of an overview of the app so people can actually see what an actual blockchain-based solution is, and then we'll do that quickly, and then we'll come back and answer questions. So you have a few minutes to pay attention to Doug, but also think through what your questions will be.
Sure, and I'll just quickly add a comment on the regulatory perspective, and provide one or two examples. But the one big picture concern among regulators is, I think we'll have to, with time, we might just have to skip quite a bit of the way in. One of the concerns among regulators is that with blockchain, it's a great way to protect information that's put in onto the chain. But the concern is that if you have garbage go in, then the garbage is going to be protected. And so the blockchain is not a solution in and of itself. Another key aspect is building a solution for sending data from the physical world, from the wind turbines, the solar panels, the thermostats, the electric vehicles, et cetera, to the blockchain. And so that's another key consideration when you're looking at any potential blockchain solutions out there is how are they interfacing between the physical world and the digital world. And then practically speaking, just an example, how regulators are concerned in certain parts of the world with renewable energy certificate and guarantee of origin markets, again, sort of that receipt that you bought renewable energy. In some parts of the world, the law says you have to work with this specific instrument. It has to be a REC or a GO. And so you have these groups, I'm not going to name any, but you have groups come up and say, we're creating a competing instrument. Well, theoretically, that's going to become if regulators aren't coming down on that now, they might prevent it moving, really scaling if they start to become a real threat to the systems. In other situations too, you have what are called registries, sort of the ledgers that are tracking these instruments, and sometimes those registries are mandated by law, and so you have to work with them. And so these are some of the questions that we are navigating every day. And so as an example, I guess I should probably.
We can jump off.
Okay.
Give you the stage.
All right. Sweet. I should probably go. How much time do we have? Sure. Let's just advance maybe, I think it's 5 or 10 slides. Let's skip the first section. Well, I'll just actually go back one. I'll just provide a summary of what EWF is. If we can just go back one. Oh, it's just being slow. No worries. So Energy Web Foundation is a nonprofit based in Switzerland, and it was co-founded by Rocky Mountain Institute and Grid Singularity. And what we're doing is building an open source platform for the energy sector using blockchain. And so you can sort of think of it as the app store of all things energy. And we are doing this in collaboration with some of the largest energy companies in the world. We actually now have the largest consortium of utilities and electric utilities and energy companies around globally. So we are building this technology, and it's open source. In addition to that, we are prioritizing some of the applications that I talked about earlier. We are working with app developers to build those, and we are cultivating an ecosystem of the startups who can actually build against these different ideas and needs that we're hearing from businesses across the world. And let's move forward a couple now. Let's just go to the next section. So it's being really slow. Sorry about that. I'm just going to briefly cover the first application that's running in this app store. Again, using that analogy, and if you can think of the Energy Web Origin app as sort of an iTunes, it's the first app that's running on the App Store. And again, it's not a perfect analogy, but it's the way that I think about it. And so what the Origin application is all about, it's about documenting the proof of renewable energy, transferring the ownership of that digital asset. So again, that receipt that you did in fact get renewable energy. It's creating a system where you can upload information about renewable generation, transfer ownership from a renewable generator to a buyer, whether that's a corporation or some other entity, and then for the buyer to then use that to generate reports. Systems today already exist for this, but there are many complaints from the transaction costs to having to work with third parties, et cetera, that we're hoping to address. But we do think also that the way that these tools work today, which if you look at them, they kind of look like technologies that were built in the early 2000s. They're not user-friendly. They discourage, we think, participants who are both smaller and medium-sized, let alone large corporations. And so today, I'll just quickly show a couple of screenshots so we can open the floor to questions. Let me... Should we maybe save it for a second? Let me scroll down. So I'll just show some, it's essentially these are just screenshots of our live user interface. It was just easier from a technical perspective to do it this way rather than a live system here. So running on the Energy Web blockchain, which is open source, this is the first open source application. And it's currently in version 1, so it's still early stage. And the overall Energy Web platform goes live next year. One of the things that you can do with Origin is start collecting information about the actual production assets. So a wind turbine here, a solar panel there, and start documenting information about that. Next. You can also document consumption assets. So let's say you want to connect your house or your office so that you can start having it document how much energy you're using, in essence to trigger a smart contract to buy renewable energy on a specific volume and a specific cadence. This is sort of what it looks like right now, and it's an early user interface. Next. You can see basic information about any renewable assets that you connect. So here's a wind turbine from one of our French affiliates, Engie. This is the wind turbine that we were collecting data from for one of our first pilots. Next slide. You can then also see which renewable energy green certificates are available. So this is Katrin. I met her. She's a German who lives outside of Frankfurt. She connected her solar panels on our roof, and she participated in a pilot as well. And this is her posting available green attributes from her solar panels in Germany. Next slide. And so we can go to the next one. And so the next 3 slides are just zoomed in parts of the same web page. Essentially, this is it's a form to initiate a smart contract where you can say, I want to buy X amount of renewable energy. So you say how much you want. You potentially can choose a time frame. I want to buy renewable energy once per day, once per month, just a single time. You can then, you then put in your information about who you are. Next slide. You can say, I want to buy from anywhere, or I want to buy from DC, or I want to buy from France, or I want to buy specifically from this company or this household, and you can put that in. You might want a minimum carbon impact. You can put that in. Next slide. You could even say it has to be fulfilling a certain certification scheme. And then when you push this purple button, that then initiates a smart contract that says, if any green attributes out there in the world, any of these certificates exist that meet my specifications as narrow or as broad as they are, find them and buy them automatically and transfer ownership. And so this, we think, will start simplifying the process for people versus today, which is a multi-month process involving brokers and several parties. Next slide. We can keep going. One more. So this is an example of, in the pilot that we executed in France with Microsoft and Engie, we uploaded information once per day from Engie wind turbines, and then once per day Microsoft specified they wanted 10 megawatt hours transferred on a daily basis. And so at midnight every night, we transferred 10 megawatt hours based on real consumption to Microsoft, and they knew in the end that they bought 10 megawatt hours from that specific wind turbine at that geolocation. And this is the kind of thing that ultimately we want to enable. One thing to be clear about, though, is that we're not planning to build this interface for a global sort of exchange or marketplace per se. We're building this template that then, no matter who the regulator is, whether you're a US regulator, a German regulator, a Japanese regulator, whomever, you can copy and paste the template code that's behind this user interface. So we think that's a nice scaling mechanism because of the different regulations in place around the world. And I think that's it. Cool. Yeah. Oh, and I guess one more, and then that's it. Can we do the next slide? Sorry. So this is just to show that we already, for those who are in the blockchain world, we're already up on Etherscan. So this is actually, an actual transaction hash associated with the Microsoft and Engie pilot. That was one of 5 that we did in April. And that's all. This Q&A.
Yeah. Cool. So that, I mean, that obviously it's slowly being rolled out, but it's just an example of a technology or usage of the technology that in a real world example. You can imagine if, from whether it's a company or your own house, and eventually you might be able to say, look, here's the interface where you want to say, I want to buy this type of renewable energy next month or every month. So with that, let's open up to questions. And I'll say again, anything can be as basic as you want it to be, and we'll try and answer it.
Okay. Please wait for the microphone and state your name before you ask your question. I'll bring it over.
Oh, yeah, okay.
Hi, this question's for Doug. It's actually about your application. So if you could go back a few slides to the one where you said the create demand situation. So I'm Rashik Raman. I'm from BM Controls. We're building something like this for peer-to-peer trading. So talk to you afterwards on it. But in that case, an example, are you the user, this woman, Teresa, she is initiating the kind of creation of demand or creation of supply. It's not governed by a smart contract, right? It's not automatically created.
So with that, the Katrine, her solar panels on her rooftop, she installed what's called the Energy Web Lite client. And so that's both a software and hardware fix that takes the data that's being generated every hour. It locks the information about that, saying it was produced by this person in this place at this time. It pushes that to the Energy Web, and then that sort of sits in it's on chain at that point. Then on the other side, in that specific pilot in Germany, we connected our office in Berlin. And so based on how much energy the Berlin office was consuming every day, that then triggered how much would be transferred from Katrine and a couple of other households to the office. And so essentially it aggregated hers and one or two other households' renewable production. And based on the smart contract initiated from the Berlin office saying consume, buy X amount of renewable energy today, Y tomorrow, that then set the terms of the transfer.
And it's done automatically.
Yeah, because it was set up such that continue to buy on a daily basis based on our consumption.
Hi, Rochelle Ely, AAAS fellow at DOE. I just have a question about the Energy Web Foundation and probably for the Power Ledger as well. How do you deal with the physical infrastructure with energy transactive exchanges? You still need to push the electrons and the electricity from place to place. You need the physical infrastructure as well as the utility to do so. So you can't really eliminate the middleman as well as you need the infrastructure.
Yeah, no question. I think this is kind of like the $10,000 question in any blockchain energy conversation. Often that component of physical infrastructure is missed. At least at Power Ledger and in some of the projects we're working on outside of the United States, we're working very closely with energy regulators and utilities where the technology enables them to reach last mile communities that may be slightly on the margin of the traditional sort of grid. And at the same time enable traditional sort of energy players to rethink how they flatten cost, where they reduce friction, because all of this friction ultimately comes back to hurt the traditional energy players and create certain degrees of vulnerabilities and cost structures that they have to overcome. So at least we're thinking long and hard about energy isn't being beamed using Bluetooth and magic. It needs physical infrastructure. So in Puerto Rico's case, we're trying to work very closely with the public utilities and the regulators around that.
Yeah, and to add to that, our Energy Web Foundation was co-founded by Rocky Mountain Institute, and the sort of perspective of RMI in informing EWF's design is that utilities are still going to be around. Even with all these startups, nobody wants to own the poles, the wires, and the other infrastructure. At the same time, to be very clear, our explicit goal is to decarbonize the energy sector. It is to digitize it, is to make it more democratic. But the big thing is reducing carbon and transitioning to clean energy. And with that, we do think we need new business models, which means less of a hub and spoke where it's a single large natural gas or coal-fired plant pushing out electricity to energy consumption, and having more smaller scale renewables production with then flexible demand. And we think you need entirely new tools to manage that. And so that's the piece that we're building, and we're working with electric utilities to understanding that they're still going to have a large role. And we also are very much welcoming regulators to participate in our system.
I would just add quickly, so one of my clients is one of the larger sort of venture funds in this space, and it's sort of that question that it adds a layer of complexity, because a lot of these things you're just moving, ones and zeros. When you have to deal with the physical delivery, it gets a lot more complicated to integrate, and so I think it's one of the reasons why energy's been a little bit slower to start to utilize blockchain technology.
My wife is a current AAAS fellow, so we should talk after. They're smart, all these scientists. In the back.
My name is Abraham Weiner. The question I had, just hearing about how blockchain might replace Rex, for the panel, do you see technologies like blockchain in the energy space replacing organized electricity markets like PJM and CAISO, or do you see those entities adopting the technology and working with groups like Power Ledger to effectively, it sounds like reducing all of the administrative burdens of managing those markets to a fraction of what they currently are?
Yeah, I mean, so if I were to wager, back to the California example a moment ago, that if the state has goals of decarbonizing by a pretty aggressive threshold by a certain date and does not leverage technology and digital transformation as a part of the process, then it's a fool's errand, right? And so I think what technologies like Power Ledger and Energy Web allow for is for people to rethink what does the energy matrix of the future look like, and for the state and the regulator to rethink what is right sizing my balance sheet and what are my core competencies to be able to provide for electricity. So there's kind of a dilemma, and you hit on it, which is that you could have energy and a competitive economy, but you cannot have a competitive economy without energy. So it is absolutely the lifeblood of a modern economy is to have an energy system. But an energy system that is decarbonized and future-proof and climate-ready after all of the failures we saw in 2017, Houston underwater, wildfires in California, record storms in the Caribbean Basin, those single point of failure energy matrices of our grandparents' generation are showing their weaknesses. And so what these technologies allow us to do is to think of an energy sort of matrix that might be a multitude of energy generation sources, but where the centralized function is the metering process, or the energy distribution process might be the centralized function. But owning the asset and owning the single carbon, coal-fired power plant, for example, becomes non-core. And so we could think of right-sizing the public balance sheet of some of these assets in the future. So I would argue there's a role to play, and we're going to see sort of a balancing act between traditional assets and these technologies in the future.
And just to add to that, in terms of what EWF is building, we're building open source infrastructure. We're not creating something that will theoretically replace the regulator. We do not want to become the regulator. So with the example of the Origin application, what we're building is an open source template that then we can say any regulator out there, wherever you're from, if you want to migrate either your existing system that's maybe based on 10-year-old technology, or you don't have a tracking system, you want to go from zero to something that's pretty modern and cutting edge, here's a template you can use. You might have to make a couple of modifications to meet your needs for your specific market, but we're not saying you can go with the PJM GAT system or Origin, because we recognize that will not work. And I think that's why some groups that have maybe done some cool things in the past year and had really good press, you're not really hearing as much about them anymore.
Final question here, up in the second row, and then, or we can do two. Probably ask both questions, and then we'll answer them, and then we'll go into more drinks, and we'll stick around. We can network and ask us more. It's hot, So go ahead.
Thank you. I know pretty much nothing about blockchain, but I heard that, Nadiesh Meyo, I am a petroleum engineer. I heard that blockchain consumes energy, so I was curious to know how will you power, how much does it consume, and how will you power those servers? And in addition, when you have these microgrids that you're talking about, for example, like in California, how will you power those microgrids? Will they take their electricity, I don't know, I guess they consume electricity. Will they take electricity from these people who are participating to a microgrid, or from where? Thank you.
Hi, I'm Valeria. I actually had the same question. So what is the fraction? For example, you're trying to save CO2 and like, is it 1% of what you're trying to save, or is it like 0.01% or 10%? And how do you think that will change in next 5-10 years? Thank you.
Oh, okay. Go ahead. Add it and we'll answer it.
Well, you talked about sort of the energy transaction between different players, kilowatt hours. But if I just think about PJM versus Origin, there are different products, right? There's capacity product, there's ancillary services, there's financial transmission rights and things like that. Can you extend this blockchain-based system to those types of services and markets for those services?
So mining, especially on the Bitcoin blockchain, does involve energy because to validate and verify the transactions, you need to use a lot of computing power, and that takes processing power and energy in order to do that. And the estimates vary from as high as about a country the size of Iceland to, I think I've seen as low as a country the size of Luxembourg, which is only about 600,000 people. That's still a lot. But the one thing I would point out is the way at least the Bitcoin blockchain is designed, the fact that it utilizes energy and there's a cost to that is important to the system, because they have what's called a 51% attack, and the fact that it costs money prevents someone from going out and acquiring control, because it would cost billions of dollars in order to go and get control and set up nodes to do this. So it's an interesting situation with the way they've structured it, is that you actually are going to, for the foreseeable future, need energy use in order to keep it secure.
And just to add to that, I do think the energy concern is really just with the Bitcoin blockchain. You have blockchains like Ethereum migrating over to new system, proof of stake. You have ones like the Energy Web Foundation using proof of authority, and these have different energy spends and significantly less. So I think it still is a concern for Bitcoin, but it should be specific to that and not the overall technology, I think. In terms of the question about Origin, for example, engaging different regulatory systems like PJM, we think we're building one application to showcase what the platform can do and providing a template, and we think that this will inspire other app developers to build similar applications in similar but different applications across the energy sector. And we also think there's an opportunity for regulators to partner with some of the startup companies and app developers that we're building ecosystem for, who are gaining an understanding of how the technology works, so that if they like, for example, how Origin works, they can then say, build something similar to this, but for this specific application within my market.
Yeah, and I guess on the energy consumption piece, I think it is very much isolated to the cryptocurrency side of the equation. But there's also, ironically, a very interesting play. It's like peak gold rush, right? That people are going to be most fervent about finding shovels and pickaxes when there's a lot of gold to be found, but soon enough, the last Bitcoin will be mined. And ironically, companies like Bitfury, which we're working closely with, are actually helping drive the renewable energy movement and sort of a lot of the efficiency that we're seeing. So Moore's Law will work in the favor of this technology as much as it has elsewhere. So I'm pretty optimistic on that.
Yeah, I mean, I think when we get that question a lot, and I think one of the things that I always say is that the people that are working on this know that's an issue, and they are working to solve it, right? And they know that it's for the future of the technology, it needs to be solved, especially for the Bitcoin public blockchain. So that, as Dante said, they're starting to use renewables in order to mine, and then that is then driving those companies who are doing renewables to innovate, and it's becoming more widespread. So in the end, it may actually help in that world and a lot more. So with that, I think if everybody wants to maybe give 30 seconds real quick, if there's any final thought on really focus on what do energy companies really need to be thinking about taking away, what can everybody go back and become, even if they're a young professional, how do you become the blockchain expert and go to the CEO and become indispensable?
Well, 75% of the jobs of the future do not currently exist. I could assure you that if you have any aspirations of being a young energy professional 10 years from today, blockchain may be somehow associated with that role, or digital transformation more broadly.
I'd say for anybody who works specifically in the energy sector that some of the notions of a future utility business model we think are becoming possible because of blockchain technology paired with a couple of other solutions that are emerging. And so stay tuned and pay attention to the Energy Web blockchain specifically. We're pretty excited about what we're putting together in the ecosystem that we're building. And I think it's an exciting road ahead.
If you're interested in this space, there is so much information available. I Google things all of the time. I watch YouTube videos. I listen to podcasts. It is the amount of information and people that are talking about this is, it's really, for me, it's kind of been the most useful thing I've done on the internet in probably a decade. So there's a ton of stuff out there if you're interested. It takes a little while to. I probably was about 6 months for me before I really felt like I had kind of a basic understanding. It's a great, very steep learning curve, but there's lots of help out there.
And on that note, actually, I'll talk just my final thought. The Global Blockchain Business Council is a global trade association headquartered in Switzerland that is representing companies that are either working in blockchain or looking to work in blockchain or representing industries that are exploring it. And we have an energy industry group that we are formulating to think about all those things. And one of the things that we really do is help curate all of that information that is out there. So we tell the companies, here's what you actually need to be paying attention to, both from an education perspective as well as ongoing regulation, because things are changing so quickly and so constantly that it's, we are trying to be the arbiters of really what is important for the leaders in the industry. So with that, go back to your companies and tell them to join because we bought you beer, so do it that way. But hopefully this was informative, and thank you to the young professionals in energy for helping to organize and bring everybody together. And do you want to say anything to finish up?
I just want to ask you guys to give a round of applause to our excellent speakers tonight. And again, a special thank you to WeWork and to GBBC for footing the bill for the beers. And with that, I think we have some time left for networking. So please stick around for a few more minutes. Hopefully our speakers are still going to be here for a few more minutes if you have any more questions for them. So thank you guys for coming.